Sony spent years building Concord, sold it for 14 days, refunded everyone, and closed the studio less than 8 weeks later. Not downsized, not reassigned, gone. Firewalk Studios joined the PlayStation family in April 2023 and vanished in October 2024. Faster than some of us could finish a single RPG on the original PlayStation. If you want more breakdowns of the decisions that can make or break a studio, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. And the short answer to how one game destroyed an entire studio is brutally simple. Firewalk was built around Concord. It had no announced backup IP, and Sony's acquisition tied the studio directly to that one game's commercial fate. Once Concord failed, closing Firewalk was cheaper and structurally easier than rebuilding hundreds of developers around a new project. But that creates a strange paradox. Sony bought Firewalk because it believed Concord made the studio valuable. That same purchase may have removed the studio's best chance of surviving Concord. Keep that thought in RAM, because the final twist is even colder than the sales numbers. The story begins in 2018, when former Bungie executives Tony Hsiu and Ryan Ellis helped establish Firewalk Studios under Probably Monsters, the company founded by former Bungie president Harold Ryan. The Bungie connection mattered. Firewalk recruited developers with experience on Destiny, Halo, Apex Legends, and Call of Duty. On paper, this was not some backroom operation held together with duct tape, pizza boxes, and a wheezing Pentium CPU. These were veterans of the biggest shooters in the business. Their project was Concord, a 5 vs 5 multiplayer game set in a colorful science fiction universe. Development reportedly stretched across many years, although the often repeated claim that Concord spent 8 full years in active production is difficult to verify. Firewalk itself had only existed since 2018. So the safer conclusion is that Concord was a long, expensive project conceived during the great live service gold rush. And the pitch made sense, at least on a spreadsheet. A traditional single-player game might earn money once, but a successful live service title could sell battle passes, cosmetics, characters, and expansions for years. Fortnite had become a cultural platform. Destiny had built an audience willing to return every week. Overwatch turned heroes into merchandise, memes, and animated shorts. Publishers no longer wanted to sell you one cartridge and wave goodbye. They wanted to become the digital arcade where you spent every evening. Sony wanted that arcade. By 2021, PlayStation had entered a publishing partnership with Firewalk for Concord. But under PlayStation boss Jim Ryan, the company's ambition grew much larger. Sony announced plans to release more than 10 live service games by the fiscal year ending in March 2, 2026. For a brand famous for God of War, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Last of Us, that was a strategic gear shift big enough to make the whole console wobble. Sony already had cinematic blockbusters, but recurring revenue was the magic phrase. $6 billion in 2022, partly for its live service expertise, and purchased Firewalk in April 2023. Sony now owned the team, the technology, and every bite of the risk. At the time, the acquisition looked logical. Firewalk had experienced developers, Concord had already been in production for years, and PlayStation needed multiplayer games. But Sony had not purchased a proven community or a successful IP. It had purchased confidence in a game the public had never played. That distinction would hit like a corrupted save file. Concord was officially announced during the May 2023 PlayStation Showcase with a short cinematic teaser. A spaceship, retro science fiction styling, a mysterious food item, and almost no explanation. It looked expensive, but viewers could not tell what the actual game was. Mystery can build curiosity, but only if people are already leaning toward the screen. 1 year later, during the May 2024 State of Play, Sony finally showed Concord properly. The presentation opened with a lengthy cinematic introducing wisecracking space mercenaries called Free Gunners. There was Guardians of the Galaxy banter, Overwatch-style hero design, and the competitive structure of games like Valorant. But by 2024, those comparisons were not helpful shortcuts. They were warning labels. Players had spent years meeting quirky heroes who cracked jokes during firefights. The market was already packed with free-to-play shooters fighting for the same limited hours. Overwatch 2, Valorant, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Rainbow Six Siege, and Counter-Strike 2. These were not boxes sitting quietly beside one another at Electronics Boutique. They were established habits, friend groups, ranked ladders, and digital wardrobes. That is the hidden difficulty of live service gaming. You are not simply asking someone for money. You are asking them to abandon their friends, their unlocked skins, their muscle memory, and perhaps 2,000 hours of progress. Back in the day, picking a console meant picking a machine. In the live service era, picking a game is practically signing a lease. Concord needed an immediate identity, but its reveal triggered recognition instead of curiosity. The dialogue seemed engineered to reproduce a style audiences were already tired of, while the gameplay appeared polished but familiar. Moment worthy of a 1990s commercial, with a spinning skull and 12 unnecessary explosions. Then came another obstacle. Concord would cost $40. A decade earlier, that might have sounded perfectly reasonable for a polished multiplayer shooter. But Concord entered a market where most of its strongest competitors were free. Sony had placed an admission fee outside a party, while 6 louder parties were already open next door. Still, price was not the real killer. Helldivers 2 had launched for $40 in February 2024, and sold 12 million copies in its first 12 weeks, becoming PlayStation's fastest-selling game at the time. Players would pay when multiplayer felt fresh, funny, and immediately worth sharing. Concord's problem was desire. People understood what it was, but too few felt they needed it. The July 2024 beta made that difficult to ignore. Even when Sony opened the second beta weekend to all players on PC and PlayStation 5, the Steam audience remained alarmingly small. But the full launch was worse. Concord arrived on August 23, 2024, and reached a Steam peak of only 697 concurrent players. 697. A single moderately successful retro gaming livestream can pull a larger crowd than that. To be fair, Steam represented only the PC audience. PlayStation 5 numbers were never released, and Sony did not confirm final sales. Any precise total should therefore be treated like a playground rumor about an unlockable nude code in Tomb Raider. But 697 was more than a disappointing number. It showed that Concord had failed to generate even a modest launch day wave. For an ordinary game, a small audience can still mean a quiet life. For a 5 versus 5 online shooter, it is a hardware failure in the social CPU. Fewer players create longer waits and less balanced matches. That produces worse experiences, which discourage newcomers, so the population falls again. A live service game can survive mixed reviews. It cannot survive empty lobbies. Sony reacted with astonishing speed. On September 3rd, Firewalk game director Ryan Ellis announced that sales would end immediately. Every purchaser would receive a refund, and Concord would be taken offline. The servers shut down on September 6th, exactly 14 days after launch. The official message left a small door open. Firewalk said it would explore options, so players imagined a free-to-play relaunch, redesigned characters, or a Final Fantasy XIV-style resurrection. Maybe Concord could disappear for a year, swap out a few creative ASICs, flash a new business model into ROM, and return as something stronger. But that door was scenery painted onto a wall. A free-to-play conversion would remove the $40 barrier, but it would not create desire. Sony would still need to fund servers, anti-cheat systems, new maps, heroes, cosmetics, marketing, and a constant content pipeline. Free-to-play does not make development free. It removes guaranteed revenue while demanding an even larger audience. More importantly, Concord had not failed after building a passionate community. It had failed at the attention stage. The week reveal, quiet beta, 697-player Steam peak, and 2-week shutdown all pointed toward indifference. A reboot works when players love the core but hate the execution. Concord's crisis was that most players did not care enough to hate it. On October 29th, Sony announced the closure of Firewalk Studios. PlayStation's Herman Hulst said certain aspects of Concord were exceptional, but the game had not reached enough players. Sony had considered its options, yet concluded that permanently sunsetting Concord and closing Firewalk was the best path forward. This is where the corporate structure became decisive. Firewalk had been assembled around Concord, and no second project had been publicly announced. Canceling the game therefore left hundreds of specialists, production systems, leadership roles, and salaries without an obvious destination. Reassigning an entire studio sounds simple, like dragging a folder to another desktop, but studios are not interchangeable blocks of memory. Absorbing that organization into another PlayStation team would require time, money, and projects capable of using those exact people. And now the loop closes. If Firewalk had remained an external studio, it might have been able to shrink, seek another publisher, pitch a smaller project, or use its veteran staff as the foundation for a new identity. None of those options would have guaranteed survival, but Firewalk would still have existed as a company separate from Concord. Sony's purchase changed the bit count of that equation. Firewalk became an internal investment whose strategic value was tied to one product. When PlayStation lost confidence in Concord, there was no independent studio left to rescue itself. Sony had bought Firewalk because Concord seemed valuable, but the acquisition effectively turned Concord into Firewalk's only continue. That is how one failed game destroyed a complete studio. Not because the developers lacked talent, and not simply because 697 players appeared on Steam, but because years of corporate planning had fused the team, the IP, and Sony's live service strategy into one fragile circuit. When Concord burned out, the entire board was easier to discard than repair. That almost makes the story sadder. Concord reportedly ran smoothly, looked technically polished, and avoided the catastrophic performance problems that derail many modern launches. Firewalk delivered a functioning game. It simply delivered the wrong game into one of the most unforgiving markets in entertainment. Concord lasted 14 days as a released product. Firewalk lasted roughly 18 months as a Sony-owned studio. But behind those tidy numbers were developers who spent years building a universe that most players visited for less time than a blockbuster rental. Sony wanted a world players would never leave. Instead, it created one that disappeared before anyone could feel nostalgic for it. Would you have given a rebuilt, free-to-play Concord another chance, or was the game doomed the moment players saw it? Share your take in the comments, and if you enjoy revisiting gaming's triumphs, disasters, and wonderfully weird forgotten corners, consider liking the video and subscribing. There are always more stories hiding behind the continue screen.